Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Downtown Guelph Parking Master Plan. This is our virtual presentation and discussion. We're glad that you could join us here this evening. And I do see there are some additional people coming in, which is great. So we'll do some of the upfront housekeeping, then have our presentation, and then have our questions and discussion. If you could advance the slide, please. So my name is Sue Cumming, and I'm a facilitator with Cumming and Company. I've been working on the public engagement for the parking study with the BA group, and I'm pleased this evening to introduce to you three key presenters: Stuart Anderson, who's a senior associate with the BA group, Ralph Bond, who's a principal with BA group, and we also have Jamie Zettel, who is the program manager of parking operations for the City of Guelph. Next, please. So why are we here? We are here tonight to provide you an update on the Downtown Parking Master Plan and to share feedback received both from the public and stakeholders throughout the engagement on the study over the last 6 months or so, and then to discuss and learn about your priorities with respect to various things we'll be talking about so that we can inform the study recommendations. Next slide, please. So the format for the meeting is fairly straightforward. The BA group is going to provide a presentation live, and following that, we'll have a Q&A. So for the Q&A, you'll note on the bottom of your screen, hopefully, you'll see a Q&A. So in that Q&A, you can click on that at any point in time, and you can write a comment or you can put a question into that Q&A. At the discussion component, but 30 minutes from now, we'll try and keep it tighter, but if we can do it in 30 minutes, that'd be great, Stuart. Then we'll be able to have some questions. So I will go right to the Q&A at that time and start to read those questions and comments out for the project team to respond to, and also to receive your comments. When I read the comment, I will not read your name. We want to protect the anonymity of everyone who's participating and be able to give you as much opportunity to ask questions or share comments. With respect to that, you can ask as many as you wish, and we'll look to sort of group different themes so we can have a really hopeful and good discussion. Following the meeting, a couple of things you might want to be aware of. We do have a survey. Survey number 2 is available on haveyoursakeguelph.ca, and that is an important survey to be open for another week, and you may be able to go there and share some thoughts there. The video of the presentation and the slide deck that's given tonight will also be posted on Have Your Say Guelph, so that's something that you'll be able to go to and see that and refer to it if you'd like to after the meeting. So we go to the next slide, please. Great. So at this point, I'd like to bring in Stuart Anderson, and you don't have to wait till the end of the presentation to put in any questions or comments. Please go ahead at any point and do that. You'll also note that the slide numbers are on the slide, so you may want to come back to a map, or you may want to come back to a particular initiative that will be overviewed for you, and we can certainly do that as part of our discussion. So thank you and welcome, Stuart. Look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Sue, and welcome to everybody. Good to see a good turnout, more than we got in the first meeting. So that's thank you for coming out tonight. Just a quick introduction. We're going to do a little refresh on what we're doing. I think hopefully most people will know this, but what we're tasked to do for the study is to look at it in as a long-term lens and figure out how much parking is required in downtown Guelph, and how it should be priced, how it should be managed, and all of this in the context of the city's goals for supporting the downtown. So just quickly then, this is the study area that we're considering. It matches there's a downtown secondary plan boundary that the city planning department has in the official plan. So that is the study area that we are following. And I'm just going to, there's a next slide coming up, but I'm just going to stay on the map for a moment. So what we're trying to do within this study is within this area, we're looking at the needs and the often conflicting needs and demands of various groups, strategies, and needs for parking. So we're trying to also make sure that this parking study, as it looks forward for the next 20 plus years, takes into account all the strategies that the city has in place, including their recent transportation master plan that really looks at trying to increase transportation by other modes, transit, cycling, walking, and not just the automobile. So it's looking at a range of different focuses. So that's what we're looking at, and looking also at the future growth. So how residential and non-residential growth in that downtown area, how that might generate changes in terms of how much parking may be required in the future. So those are the many influences on parking. This diagram is just trying to indicate how parking influences things and how those things influence parking. So a few of them I've mentioned already: the transit, the changing transportation patterns, the increased development activity that is expected in downtown Guelph and citywide over the next 20 years. So Sue had mentioned we've been going for more or less 6 months on this study, I think a little longer. We are now at the bottom of this page. We're getting into the area of looking at developing those recommendations. So we've done a bunch of background work in the fall and in the spring. So I'm just going to get into some of those now, but we're kind of getting to the business end, and this meeting is important because now we want to make sure we understand people's opinions, thoughts, priorities, especially for what they see the parking system evolving into in the future. So here's a quick list of what we've done so far. We started off with some fairly extensive data collection back in the fall, measuring how the parking spaces were used in the system. We've also had some individual and some group stakeholder meetings. I think over 30 different meetings over the past little while. So we've met with a lot of people. We've heard a lot of things, and we're trying to record all of that and consider all that as we go through. We've started recently to also look at the financial side of things and how how the system might get paid for in the future. So we'll cover that a little bit tonight too. Just a quick recap. I'm going to flip to the map of this again next, but basically the city's parking system is roughly 50-50 in terms of the supply being in the parking structures and in the surface. So by that I mean there's around 1,300 spaces in the 3 parkades that the city has, and the off-street lots there's around 500 spaces, and then there's also the on-street parking as well throughout the downtown. So there's quite a lot of it that's in the parkades. And as I think everybody on the call probably knows, there's the parking system is managed with its use being through permits. There's a lot of permits that are able to be purchased for a number of the parking facilities. There's also short-term use cash parking on a daily basis, and the city also runs the special event parking, particularly around the Guelph Storm games and the events at the River Run Center and other things in the downtown. So I'm not going to get too much into this, but again, when we looked at the surveys that we did back in the fall of 2022, overall, the overall picture was one where the system as a whole had some spare capacity. And in saying that, I don't want to gloss over the fact that there were certain locations that were very busy, in particular the on-street parking around Wyndham in particular, but in the Baker Street area, there seemed to be a number of places where it's getting pretty busy. So overall, it's got capacity, but in certain hotspots, there's areas that look like we need to look at those a little further. The key thing also that we've noticed, and I didn't say at the outset, but there was a study done 5 years ago for a parking master plan, and when we look at the the amount of parking that was being used then and now, there was an obvious reduction due to the amount of people working from home, hybrid working, etc., in 2022 and going on into 2023. So that's a key thing. So we're starting to look, and this is getting into the growth ideas and looking at the growth based on the city's growth management strategy, and some direction from the province on how much growth needs to be accommodated by the downtown Guelph area in particular. So these are some of these scenarios that we're looking at. So this is a short to medium term, where one of the key tenants currently in the downtown is the cooperative is going to be moving out of the downtown and is to be replaced in that building with the Conestoga College campus, which is going to phase in over a couple of years once they do renovations to the buildings and move their people in. So that will ultimately end up with what we think is an increased demand based on the number of new students and faculty and staff. There's the new library as well that will be developed on the Baker Street redevelopment, and I think it's around about twice the size of the existing one. So we're expecting some increased demand, parking demand, to come from that as well. So overall, we're thinking there's a good number in the medium term, around about 650 spaces of additional demand that could come out. And also there's the possibility that the current hybrid working patterns could change and sort of bring back more demand as well. So when we start to look at the long term, that's really looking at what the growth management strategy and the city's housing pledges have laid out for the next 20 years. And there starts to be a reasonable number of new employees in the downtown based on those growth forecasts. Around about 1,000 new employees downtown. And we're looking at, again, this is long term, but up to 4,400 new apartment units in that downtown area. So some substantial growth. And with that, we would expect some additional parking demand to occur. That will be tempered, of course, by the extent to which people switch to other modes of transportation, use the transit system that the city is working on upgrading and changing the levels of service for the transit system as well. So we do expect that there will be some changes. It will not be the same travel patterns that we see today. So that leads to what we're trying to think of in terms of a possible a few directions for what the municipal parking supply could look like in the future. There's an expectation that we have that there will need to be additional municipal parking in the area that I'll refer to it as south of the tracks, but sort of in that area centered on Fountain Street, in that area there, where there's an expectation that there will be a lot of redevelopment in that area in particular. And again, with the new library and other new uses in the downtown, we'd also expect that there looks like there'd be a demand for additional parking supply in that northern area of the downtown. So that's the area that's not as well served by the current parkades, the ones on the Market Parkade and then the two east and west parkades on MacDonnell. So those look like the key areas as far as we are making out from our study. Again, like I said at the outset, there's a number of things that affect those parking demands, and so how much work from home and hybrid work continues into the future in the long term is a bit of a crystal ball gazing exercise when we start to try to look more than 10 years out in the future. So we are looking at scenarios of different uptakes of transit and different uptakes of working from home or working from downtown offices to try to cover those.
Sorry, someone was asking, you've got on the third bullet, WFH.
Oh, I'm
That's
sorry.
work from home, but that's,
Yes. Sorry, I meant to explain that. Apologies to everyone. Yes, the WFH was the abbreviation for work from home, and the TMP was the abbreviation for the Transportation Master Plan,
thank you.
which has been set up by the city. Yeah, so overall, with the plus 10 years crystal ball, the pace of those changes is one thing that I think we can all agree is uncertain. So we're looking at scenarios to try to model some different outcomes. I mentioned the financing. We've started to look in a bit more detail at that. There's some key aspects of that I wanted to raise tonight, but not get into the weeds of, but there is and will be a need for increased maintenance and rehabilitation spending for the existing parkades from a building safety standpoint once we sort of get beyond the 10 to 20 year horizon. And there's some pretty large costs associated with that. There's also the costs of building, if we recommending new parking structures, they're one of a decent size in a downtown, and there's a range, but I've just put a number there. Round about 30 million is something that would probably be in the right ballpark for something that would accommodate 500 parking spaces. So there are some big costs, and there's questions of how much of that should be borne by the parking system itself, or how much of that is an investment by the city using tax money essentially from property taxes. So those are the financial scenarios we're starting to look at, and again there'll be a range of options and scenarios for how those might play out, to kind of a spectrum. So right now the city does provide property tax money to support the parking system or invest in the parking system for the downtown. So that's a current situation, and one of the questions we're looking at is, does that continue in the future, or does it increase, or does it decrease, and what are the options about that? There's some possible new revenue sources that we are looking at as part of this study. One is known as payment in lieu of parking, and that is where a developer for a new development in the downtown could take an option to provide less parking than it would be required by the bylaw for new development, but instead sort of pay for that difference in terms of by making a contribution to the city parking system, so that the city would then use that money to build parking that could be available for everybody as public use, as opposed to simply just within a building itself. There is also the possibilities of payment for on-street parking that was looked at previously in the last master plan back in 2015. And then there's also options about, do you put money aside to cover future capital expenses and sort of almost make a reserve fund, a savings fund to pay for future things, or do you plan on borrowing most of the capital needs for the future? So there's some very different scenarios that play out depending on how those would advance. So just wanted to touch back on some of the consultation and stakeholder engagement we have done over the last while, and getting into the next slides, we're going to touch on some of the key things that we've heard through the meetings and conversations we've had so far. So again, hopefully today we have time for good conversation. A little bit to go in the presentation, but hopefully we'll still have the better part of an hour for conversations tonight. This is one of the findings. So we did a survey that was available on Have Your Say Guelph, that we had 1,000 or actually 1,300 respondents for that survey, and of those 1,000 or so were identified themselves as drivers to the downtown. And the survey, these respondents, there were fewer that walked and cycled and took the bus, but there's a component there. The key things we found was, I'll just touch on the big ones. The majority of the responses were people who came downtown on a weekday for a couple of hours and used on-street parking. So that was the key one that we noted. So that seems to be something that we really need to consider when we're planning for the future system. We asked some questions in the survey about what people's key challenges were, and some of these are quite related to each other, but the big one is people responding that they couldn't find parking close to where they wanted to be. There was some also comments about the overall supply, and comments about the cost of parking in downtown. We definitely heard that. Some opinions that the cost of permits or the cost of the daily parking is high in some people's opinions. So those were the big ones. There were more, but those are 6 ones that kept coming up in the 1,300 responses we got. So I'm not going to go into great detail. I would like to leave more time to talk about during the next part of this meeting, but there's some key themes here and some ideas to consider. I just wanted to touch on the ideas in this presentation right now. So about amount and proximity of parking, some of the ideas that we could consider are to respond to some of the themes we heard were looking at different ways of using the parkades. Instead of being paid only, we could look at use of parkades to have either a reduced fee or no fee, depending on the length of parking stay. So that might assist with providing more short-term visitor parking. And again, we'd heard those comments about parking needs north of Quebec, in particular, north of Quebec and Douglas, and other comments about ability to find parking. So there's some possible strategies there about signage and apps to make that information more easily available to people. The cost again was a big item that came up in many of the consultation sessions. So some of the things that we're going to be looking at is the ability to share a parking pass. So it might be that members of an office who are in a hybrid work situation and may be able to share a permit instead of buying one each. So that sort of helps with reducing the cost, but also I think it helps with efficiency. So some of those things we can get into in the study and get into in the discussion. But we're thinking if there is on-street paid parking as one of the options that gets recommended in the study, it would be something that would be phased in gradually to see how it works out. There were some comments about the conditions, the sort of physical conditions of the parkades and safety within them. So there's some ideas, and in fact, some of them are likely going to be implemented next year in the near future, which is painting interiors of the parkades to make them brighter, lighter. The lighting has been upgraded, in fact, already. So that's I think that's a recent change that has made a big difference inside those parkades from the old kind of yellow dark lights to the bright new white ones. We've had some conversations already, a couple of meetings with the Accessibility Advisory Committee, and on the right side of this slide is a direction that we've had from the Accessibility Advisory Committee at the city. So looking at having a working group set up to specifically look at accessible parking within the downtown and how it should be distributed or redistributed to meet the needs as identified by people within that group. So those are the key things. Bicycle parking as well. We've had some comments, some detailed comments actually from the GCAT, the Gulf Coalition for Active Transportation, and looking at those in particular. One of the big ones is the need for secure bicycle parking in the downtown. So there's currently the secure bike cage within the Market parking garage, but beyond that, the rest of the parking in the downtown for bicycles is by way of racks, posts, rings. Is a bit of a variety, but it's not fully secure. So looking at those options is one thing we'll be doing. And looking at the Guelph GO station and how some changes could be made in that area to increase the supply and increase the secure supply in particular, given that the increased use of that GO station is likely to be for all-day commuters who will want to have somewhere secure to leave a bicycle. This is now just getting to the current survey. It's still open, as Sue mentioned. And again, in the interest of leaving some time, I'm not going to go through the great detail, but within that survey, we had created 4 different scenarios, which are intended to sort of come up with an idea of what parking and what visiting the downtown might look like in terms of a 7 or 8 year time horizon, and then 8 year plus out into the longer distance future. So we crafted a range of questions, comments, statements that you can go through the survey and comment on whether you agree with them or what you like and what you don't like. I'm just going to very quickly skip through those. I'm not going to read all of these. As you can see, there's a lot of text here, but this is sort of the general idea that there's 4 different scenarios that you can look at, think about how you personally relate to those scenarios and what you think the downtown should look like in those sort of time horizons. Sue, I think this is probably where I want to pass back to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you,
welcome.
Stuart. So moving forward, the public survey is there, number 2, till January, I think July the 8th next week. You can please send any comments to Jamie Zettel. His information's here at guelph.ca. And my understanding is that the team is working to put a presentation together for the Committee of the Whole, which is scheduled for September the 6th. So I wanted to flag that for you. And I believe individuals can delegate at council and by registering with the clerk's office. So just important information that you would have available to you. We go to the next slide. So please go back to there we go. So we've heard a lot of things in the public engagement and lots of thoughts about people who don't live in the city but work in the city. Lots of people who are finding cost of parking to be very challenging. We know lots of people really like the on-street complimentary parking. We know people have concerns about the parkades in terms of access to them, the conditions, and also the cost of them. So we've heard lots of different things from a variety of stakeholders, and certainly through the meetings, the public session, and of the survey. And we really want to get a sense tonight, if we could, from you on how bold the city should be in implementing strategies for addressing parking needs and encouraging the change. So 5 things we just thought to put up here for you was, should the city be incentivizing parking in the parkades through improved conditions, through reducing charges, through maybe offering complimentary 1 to 2 hour parking there, having shared permits, so making them more viable for many to go and park in the parkades. The sense of shifting away from the complimentary on-street parking and increasing the use of those spaces for short-term stay close to the destination parking. We know that the downtown needs to be a very vibrant place, and parking has a factor in that vibrancy. So how do we look at the balancing out of where people can park and how they can get to different destinations? We have heard the need for parking potentially north of Quebec and Douglas Streets in the north end. So again, some thoughts about should the city be looking to do that over the next many years. Secure bike parking and e-bike parking, of course, has come up. Looking at implementing perimeter and wayfinding signage. And the development of a municipal parking app is also one of the things that could be considered. Certainly also electric charging vehicles. And we know there's been lots of interest in whether or not transit would play a bigger role in the future. The survey didn't net that out in terms of the people's conversations, but we know it's an important goal in trying to determine how best to ensure that can move forward with the city. So these are some of the top ideas or examples to consider, and we'd really like to get your feedback on these and other ideas. So you may have a comment, you may have a question, and we certainly welcome all of those. So I'm going to start to go to the Q&A right now, and please put in your questions and comments. If it's a comment, then I will read it out, and certainly we may not be providing a response to, but certainly something that will be noted. We will be taking all of the conversation that happens this evening, will be put in a transcript that will be available on the website and will also be used in the feedback report to council. So it's really important to hear your thoughts and your views. So with that in mind, I'm going to go right to the questions and start to read them out. And if you were joining us just partway through the presentation, there's a Q&A at the bottom. You'll see if you click on that, you can start to type in that. I will not read your name aloud when I read out the questions and the comments. We will read them out, and certainly you can put in as many as you would like to. So one of the first ones wrote in earlier in the presentation was the master plan, which is being developed by the city, appears to be very dismissive of the fact that a large number of the employees of the various employers in the downtown are from out of town, especially where transit links do not exist. Communications and surveys feel very tone deaf to this situation and is aggressive to employees who have little to no recourse. With the pain of rapid and rampant inflation, including by the hand of council itself, through raising permit fees by almost 50% over the last 4 years. How can we make sure that we aren't priced out of working within the downtown with all the factors that are at stake here? Thank you very much for the question and in that respect. Is that something that Stuart or Ralph you'd be able to comment on at 716?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question. I like it. Yes, so it gets to a number of different things, and I'll try to be brief. But yes, right now when you look at the travel patterns of employees in the downtown, there's a good number who come from outside of the city, and who do come from areas where there is not a good or an easy transit connection. So we're certainly cognizant of that. Having said that, though, there's a number of changes that the city's making for their own transit system. And I mentioned that the city's transportation master plan that was approved by council last year was setting in place a system and a strategy to encourage the use of other transportation modes rather than the automobile. So we're definitely considering all of those things that all play together. So there's still going to be a component for sure of people who let's say live in Kitchener and come and work in Guelph, or in many more examples, but that's just one of them. There will be the all-day two-way GO service in the future, so that's going to connect a few more communities and provide a few more options for people to work in downtown Guelph. There's kind of a lot in this question, so one of the other things I just wanted to say, yes, the parking rates have gone up, and I think possibly one of the reasons for that is in the last parking master plan, there was a recommendation for paid on-street parking to be brought in, which obviously would have been a revenue stream that may have helped with the overall system, as far as maybe not having to raise the permit rates as much. So there's a number of different things that play into this. I'll stop talking now, because I think I've said what I wanted to, but it's a great question, and it's one we're definitely grappling with.
Thank you. I've got a number here more to read out. Free on-street parking is so important for our business. It's the only positive thing people have to say about parking, which is for the most part dismal. We have a very low average sale, so we need many, many people coming through. As you can see from your own survey, people want to park on street for free. Gives them better deals in the so if you give them better deals in the parkades, free on-street parking is the best marketing tool that we have. So I really appreciate the comment. I don't know whether Ralph or Stuart, you wanted to comment on the comment, but it's certainly important and a message to continue to convey in the work that we're doing. One possibility that's not yet mentioned here is to establish free parking lots on the outside of town and offer paid frequent shuttle buses to take folks in and out of the downtown core. This would be a cheaper option than building parkades on high value real estate in the downtown core. That's at 737. So to read out these comments and suggestions.
I'll just comment on, I guess, the previous one and this one. So the on-street parking being a complementary feature and not having to be paid for, essentially that's, you know, this study is looking at options, like I said, and one of the outcomes of that, providing that sort of service to people and to want to come downtown Guelph and enjoy that complimentary 2-hour parking, is that the city effectively does forego some revenue in order to do that. So there's been a decision made in the past that that's okay, and that revenue is then made up by tax support from the city. So that's a decision the city's made in the past, and it could well be the decision that council makes again this time around. So we're going to look at the options and put the math together, and ultimately council will make the decision on how they want to proceed. To the second question, the parking shuttle, it's something that's come up in conversations, and is something we will be looking at. The one thing where it's great for events and things like that, where the roads are closed, or there's other things that get in the way of normally, or of making a trip as you normally might to the downtown. But if there's no events and it's just, you know, typical Monday to Friday activities in the downtown, it's challenging from a travel time point of view to provide something that really competes with driving or cycling by way of having to park on the periphery and then wait for a shuttle and then take the shuttle. So you'll typically find in a community like Guelph, from certain areas, you can drive downtown in a very short amount of time, that if the travel time is sort of twice as long to have to park and wait for a shuttle, then it sort of becomes a less attractive option. But that's not to say we're not looking at it. I'm just wanted to point that out.
Stuart, there was another comment here. I'm going to keep reading through. There's many. New this year for the Multicultural Festival, there was a shuttle bus that ran from the downtown parkade to the park. The daily fee was $3. If we could expand upon this for events or have it more widely known, it would really help with congestion and make more use of the parkade. And that related to a specific event or festival, which you also had referenced in your comment. Thank you for that. I've got a comment and question. How does the city plan to address the issue of where a large percentage of on-street parking is taken by commercial vehicles, such as contractors and others? And additionally, how do you plan to address a serious lack of longer-term accessible parking that is closer to destinations versus parkades, which can be very out of reach for those with disabilities? I could address the second part. Stuart, did you want to address the first part?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, so one of the things that we are, sorry, it's hard to cover everything in half an hour, but we are looking at loading zones in particular as well in this study. So places where larger vehicles could stop and unload or load to support businesses in the downtown. So that's something we are taking a look at, where those could be, should be, how many there might be. It's something the city's also looked at previously in their streetscape master plan that was done a number of years ago. So there's already some ideas out there that the city had, and we'd like to build upon those. But that is something that I think we will be identifying a need to provide those spaces for the trucks in the future.
Thank you. Second part of this, just to read it out again, was how do you plan to address the serious lack of longer-term accessible parking that is closer to destinations versus parkades, which can be very out of reach for those disabilities? On June 20th, we made a presentation to the Advisory Accessibility Committee, and there was a motion was put forward by the committee to establish a working group with the city staff to identify where there may need to be a movement from parking space from one street to another to ensure that there is on-street parking close to destinations. So that's very much a recommendation that came from the Accessibility Advisory Committee and is being acted on as part of the outcome of the study. So that's just important that you've raised that, and it's something that is on the minds of those that are looking at that very closely. So thank you for the question and comment. And I keep going here. How would you monitor 15-minute parking when the city finds it difficult to monitor free 2-hour parking? That's at 738.
Yeah,
Certainly.
that's definitely one of the more difficult ones to monitor and enforce. I mean, it essentially comes down to having to spend more money on enforcement to make that work. Yeah, you can't simply come around every 2 hours and monitor it because it doesn't work. So that's how you'd have to do it, with either more people on the street doing the bylaw enforcement or a different technology that would be able to do that as well.
I'm going to keep going. Are there any streets wide enough to use reverse angle parking to create more spaces rather than curb parking? That's at 743.
Well, I think the answer is yes. I think Cork Street would be one of them, but there are certain locations where you could add to parking by implementing the angled parking instead of the parallel parking. You may need to get into changing a street to one way in order to. We haven't looked at the full details of that, but I would say there's separate work going on that isn't part of the study, that is on the downtown revitalization projects, Wyndham Street being the one that's underway now. So that is something that the city's looking at, how when it rebuilds Wyndham Street. I can't really speak too much to the study because we're not working on it, but when they rebuild Wyndham Street with all the infrastructure underneath of it, what it actually ends up looking like on the top, as far as how the parking and bicycle facilities look and work. So that may have some kind of impact anyway.
Okay. Going to keep going. At 739, the master plan seems focused on commuters or visitors into downtown. What consideration is being given within the master plan to assist new residents within downtown to live without a car and not indirectly pay for the construction of a parking space, including through reduced or eliminated minimum parking rates? That's at 739.
Yeah, that's a good question too. We are again, just through trying to cover everything in half an hour. In the introduction, I neglected to talk to this, but that is a consideration, part of this study. So how much parking there should be per unit for new residential buildings in the downtown is something that we are looking at, and the implications of, a couple of scenarios of different rates or different ratios within that. So it's something that is being looked at. I don't know if, Ralph, I don't know if you had a comment on sort of the second part of this question, which is the financial side of it, I guess. So
yeah, well, yeah, we have as part of this study, we've actually surveyed 10 buildings in downtown to understand just how the parking demand works now in apartments, and it's suggesting we should reduce the rate, but the rate isn't zero, and the challenge is coming up with the right balance for it, because people, if we make the number too low, people will still move into the buildings and want to park in city parking garages. That's what we've seen in other locations where this has happened. So it's trying to come up with the balance between recognizing that the existing requirement is too high, but not making it so low that we end up with some of the parking facilities overused by residents because there wasn't enough provided on the development site. So we are looking at it, and we're going to come in, take a look at that. There could be infill projects in the happens in old downtowns where it's very difficult for people to build apartment buildings on small sites, and if they can't supply parking for good reasons, the city could consider reductions in the parking to facilitate new development. And in some cases, some cities ask the developer to pay a bit of a fee for letting them out of that, because they know, again, some of the people, even though they can't provide the parking on the site, some of those people will then show up and ask the city to provide some parking for them. That happens now in some of the remote lots the city has, where some residents are using those lots. So we're looking at all that, and we're going to try and come up with something that seems to make sense, and then it can be reevaluated in the future as maybe every 5 years the city looks at it again, and if it looks like we can adjust the numbers down in the zoning bylaw, we'll do that.
Great. Thank you very much. Got more questions to read out or comments. So this one is at 7:20. The first thing relates to permit parking, especially in the Arthur Street lot. If demand has decreased, why is there a year-long wait list? And B, do you prioritize permits for residents living in adjacent neighborhoods? That's at 7:20. I don't know if that's a question that you could address, or whether that's something that Jamie might be able to address.
Go ahead, Jamie, if you want.
So that's a 7:20, Jamie. So it references that the Arthur Street lot permit parking, that if the demand has decreased, then why is there a year-long wait list? And do you prioritize permits for residents living in the adjacent neighborhoods?
That's a great question, and thank you for asking it. The Arthur Street lot is intended only for residents who live downtown. So eligibility to park in that lot requires that you need to provide a municipal address that you live in the area. So it is intended for people who live on Arthur Street and the adjacent streets. The reason why there is little room in that parkade or in that parking lot is because it's only a 24 stall parking lot, and it is used by residents. So all those permits have been sold to local residents, and that's where they park their family vehicles. So it doesn't have that same turnover that some of the facilities that are in the core of downtown have. So where we see the reduced demand is for primarily about commuters and office workers and those coming into the downtown. But the Arthur Street lot and the Norwich Street lot, which is not far from it, are really focused on providing a parking opportunity for those people that live in the area that either do not have their own driveway, don't have access to parking, or might have an excess of vehicles that need local parking to support the residents.
Great, Jamie, thank you. The second part, the second point that I wanted to raise too, is that many people in residential downtown parking catchment area do not have driveways. And if we've already paid for lot parking, which has more than doubled in cost in recent years, will payment for a street permit be waived if permitting on residential streets roll out? So that's something to review in terms of if you were to roll out a residential street parking. That's also at 7:20.
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a great comment. We haven't really looked at that problem yet, and I think it's one of the problems that Stuart and Ralph will help us examine. So although I can't give you a definitive answer right now, it's certainly something that's being considered and looked at.
Thank you. There's another comment here. Why is growth in downtown assumed to come hand in hand with more demand for auto spaces? Travel demand is not independent of public policy, infrastructure availability, and the existence of mixed-use walkable neighborhoods. Will the parking master plan team more carefully consider the opportunity cost of building more parking and compare it with alternative modes of serving travel demand? That's at 721.
Yeah, that's a great question too. It touches on a number of things. So yes, 100% yes, we will carefully consider the opportunity cost. So one of the numbers that was up before was something like $30 million for a new parking facility. So if you don't need to spend that money, and you don't need to borrow to spend that money, that frees up a huge chunk of money you could use for something else. So if you spent that money, for instance, on improving transit service or providing additional cycling facilities, it would do a lot. So it is something we are considering. And like we said at the beginning too, there's a number of different city strategies and policies. The big one in particular for this question is the city's transportation master plan that was approved by council last year, 2022, which was its final recommendations were to work towards a system in which the number of people, or the percentage of people driving citywide is planned to drop significantly, and that transportation master plan puts strategies in place in order to make those changes.
There's a comment here that relates to this at 748. So it's surprising, this person writes that only 3% from survey 1 indicated that they come into downtown by transit. Is it part of this plan to look at shifting tax dollars from transit over to parking? And the desire for more people to ride transit is understandable, but doesn't perhaps align with the reality that people want to drive.
Yeah, one thing I would say just quickly is, so that 3% was based on the survey that we did, which was to do with the parking master plan. So it doesn't necessarily capture all of the people in Guelph. It certainly captured people who have an interest in parking. So maybe there's a bit of a skew there. But having said that, from various meetings and stakeholder engagement that we have done, there does not currently seem to be a huge amount of use of transit to get downtown for employment in particular. It could be bigger, and that's one of the things certainly that the transportation master plan is planning on doing, and that's the direction that the city council has taken. And the transit service improvements as well that are, again, I think that's been approved. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jamie, but there's a plan in place for the next 10 to 20 or 10 plus years on increasing service and changing routes, etc., to try to get to those goals that are laid out in the transportation master plan. So there's changes coming to try to make that a better option, I think, for residents of Guelph.
Part of that question was that whether you're recommending shifting tax dollars away from transit over to parking. I don't think that you've said that. I think it's you recognizing that these things happen over time. So I don't know if you make a comment on that, Stuart.
Yeah, I mean, I think this study, I mean, we're hired to look at the parking system in particular, and so we're not going to be making recommendations about the city's transit budgets or their any other budget. So we're focused on the parking side of things. So I think the simple answer to that one is no, we wouldn't be. But again, we're trying to look at the parking system in a holistic way, and transit does affect that. So it affects how much demand that we might see in the future.
I'm going to keep going. So this person wanted to follow up on the response that was given to the first question about the out-of-town employees, where it seemed, Stuart, it says, sorry, identify communities such as Kitchener, where transit links exist, but seem to ignore the rural communities directly north of Guelph, where a large population exists that work within the city, for example, Fergus, Elora, Arthur, and Mount Forest, and that these are all areas that are not serviced by any transit options, and there are no plans for transit for these workers. So it's an important clarification, and we appreciate your comment. And again, these are comments that will be noted in the feedback report that will be part of the council report as well. And it's important to acknowledge that clarification. I'm going to keep going. I've got another one at 7:52 here. So 3 comments. The person writes, 1, the reason downtown street parking is dismal is because it is being provided for free, complimentary. The city must implement dynamic parking pricing on downtown streets to ensure there are always a few parking spots available and to reduce congestion. San Francisco and other cities have already done this with great success. Number 2, besides dynamic parking pricing based on time and location, will one of your recommendations be a weight-based parking permit as Montreal Borough is now implementing? Heavier the vehicle, the higher the parking cost. And thirdly, parking fees must equal the cost of a 2-way transit fare, which is $6.50 for the first hour. So I don't know if you have any comments on that. These are obviously opinions that we're hearing, which is good to have the comments. At 7:52.
I can try a little bit on
sure.
that one if you want. It's, I mean, we're hearing it's the usual tension between, people thinking they need the free parking to continue so their businesses survive. And then if you leave the parking free, the misuse of parking that occurs. So, I think we've seen a comment earlier that contractors are taking up a lot of the on-street parking. We often find employees in the stores take up on-street parking, and we've heard some people describe to us that they move their cars around, to avoid the 2-hour reparking thing to again try to get free parking. So on the one hand, the free parking is an incentive for some of the businesses downtown, but it comes with baggage and problems, which I just described. And if you did charge for parking, you could get rid of a lot of those problems, because people then would shift to other locations and maybe into the parkades if you also reduce the cost of parking in the parkades. But it's trying to come up with that balance to try to keep everybody happy. A lot of people will drive around the block several times because the parking is free instead of parking in a parking garage. So there is benefits to charging for parking, and it's just trying to figure out how to balance that out. And if you just started charging for on-street parking, is there something else you could do in the parking to reduce the cost there for some people? So we're going to look at that and talk about the different options that the city can consider on it. We aren't looking at a weight-based approach to vehicle weight to charge more for heavier vehicles. I think we've got enough to deal with in terms of wrestling with that whole issue of should on-street parking be free, or how should that work?
Thank you. One of the items, Ralph, that was in the scenarios that are on the survey was that in the future, and I think this was in the 8 to 15 years, that it would be ideal if a transit pass costs less than a parking pass. And I think that may be where this person was also going in terms of trying to encourage that sort of equity and how you deal with the equity issue. I don't know if you have any comments on that sort of encouragement piece, or whether I should keep going to some of the other questions and comments here.
Well, no, it's a good comment, and that explains partly why some of the monthly parking fees are high today. It's not only to help pay for the cost of the parking garage, but it's also to keep the fees high enough that it encourages some people to think about using transit or carpooling or some other method of traveling. And research has shown if you keep the cost of the monthly parking higher than a transit pass, which it is today in the prime parking garages, then then that helps. And so, I think we're trying to keep that balance in place. Parking is expensive. To build new parking in a garage today, the last garage that was built, Market Street, was $55,000 a space, roughly. If you had to, if we asked people to pay the cost of recovering that $55,000 a space, they'd be paying almost $300 a month. And so we understand some people don't like the high cost of the parking now, but even at the rates that are being charged in the garages, it's only paying for half the cost of providing it. So it's all a very difficult challenge to tackle, because if the city has to build and maintain parking garages, the money has to come from somewhere, and it's just trying to strike that balance, and we're looking at all of those factors.
Yeah. Thank you, Rob. Got another which relates to this as well. Is there any plan to reduce the parking permit cost for the average person working downtown Guelph? I work full-time in a retail store downtown. I need to bring boxes of products, etc., with me to work, making transit or cycling not an option. The price of the parking permits is too high to justify on my salary. I think it's important to provide affordable parking for employees downtown. I'm wondering if this is being considered. We also heard through the survey, through some of the stakeholder groups, just to highlight that the need for potentially having discounts for certainly social service providers and other sort of types of employees in the downtown. So Ralph, I don't know if you've got a comment on that, or Stuart, at 7:30, at 7:55, and we'll keep going. We've got many others after this.
Well, I think it ties into what I just tried to explain, all the different factors that go into the parking. And so we have heard, as you mentioned, Sue, some special service agencies have brought up the same comment. So we have businesses, a lot of businesses saying they still want to maintain the free parking. We have other people saying they want to reduce the existing cost of parking. That is understandable, but it then begs the question as to where all the money comes from to pay for even the existing parking that costs a lot of money to run each year, or if we have to build or refurbish the existing parking garages. And the alternative would be to keep increasing people's taxes across the whole city to reduce the parking rates in the downtown. That could be looked at too. The city already does that today to a significant amount. In the future, if they have to build more parking facilities, that is going to increase. So it's trying to strike the right balance with all of that, and come up with something that seems to make the most sense. And so we're going to look at several options for that, and we may come out with a recommendation, or we may simply suggest that there's 2 or 3 different ways to deal with this, and here's what the options are. But it would be I guess my thinking on it so far is we couldn't get to the point where we just keep reducing parking rates for everybody everywhere. So I think we're going to look at how we can do it in a way that seems to make sense, but not discourage all the other factors that we're trying to take into account.
Great. Thank you. I've got quite a number of comments here, and I want to make sure we get to them all. It's about 8:07. So we had intended to conclude at 8:30. If we need a bit more time, we can do so. But I'm not going to read out the comments. So it's important that we have these noted. So one person writes, what about people that commute from out of town and don't have the means to take transit, walk, or bike? The parking permit is too expensive, and it's close and above downtown Toronto rates. The city should open up a program for employers downtown so that they could purchase a bunch of passes at a discounted rate. So that's something that we note and important to consider. A person writes, there was a great comment on Twitter this week regarding downtown. A business owner observed the usual circling of downtown by drivers looking for on-street parking. He also noted that the Market Square Parkade sign shown over 400 available spaces. He said, we have a walking problem, we need a marketing strategy for the parkades, and definitely a phase out of free on-street parking. So thank you. Someone else writes, I would encourage the city not to look at money lost through free parking, but as a marketing expense, which encourages people to come downtown. It's another one. And another person writes, has the potential impact of third-party autonomous vehicles and their market penetration been taken into future scenarios? That's at 8:03. Maybe more of a question, maybe a short response if that's possible. Is that something that Stuart or Ralph could comment on?
Yeah, maybe autonomous vehicles is something that that I've looked at for a number of real estate developers and institutions like hospitals, because they're asking the question, if autonomous vehicles arrive, will we still need the parking? And the short answer to that is, if and when they arrive in significant enough quantities, it should reduce the amount of parking that people need. It's not going to happen based on everything that we've looked at for at least 20 years, probably 30 years. There was a lot of hype about autonomous vehicles, 5 or 10 years ago, and all the high-tech people said they were going to be here by now. They sound good. They will be good the day they arrive, but the technological, regulatory, insurance impediments, and I could go on forever, are huge. And even if they could get a perfect autonomous vehicle running in the next few years, people on average keep their vehicles about 10 years. So it would take the people who own existing vehicles 10 years to switch into them, even if it happened tomorrow, but it won't. So, I said it was going to be a short answer. They will help in the long term, but not in the next 20 years.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to keep going with lots of questions and comments here. And this is maybe more of a comment. Many zones in downtown have no minimum parking requirements for non-residential uses, including hotel uses. But if the space is converted to a residential use, including for affordable and rental housing, high minimum parking rates exist. Can this discrepancy be rationalized due to the high need for rental housing and the very soft market for office due to work from home? I think that gets back to the zoning question, Stuart, that you addressed in terms of the different numbers for parking requirements. That's at 7:53.
Yeah, certainly for the residential, like we mentioned, we are looking at coming out with a recommended change to what the zoning bylaw says. And that comment is quite right. Yeah, for 99%, I think, of the commercial uses in that area north of the tracks, there is no requirement for those commercial developments to provide any parking. So that's, in effect, why, or one of the reasons why the city has a large presence in parking in downtown Guelph is to support the development of those types of land developments that do take place that don't provide individual parking, but rather the city provides a communal parking resource that everybody can use. So that's the way things have been set up there for a while. So yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to read two different comments from two different commenters together because they're somewhat linked. First is, have you considered the overall economic benefit to downtown by less on-street parking and more public space for on-street patios, public art, shade trees, and a vibrant destination? City staff are recommending the patio program be made permanent, for example. So that's the first person. Second person writes, when you're evaluating options, how will all the negative externalities of parking, including the impact on the public realm, induced demand, pedestrian safety, and climate goals, and the alternative options of street trees, bike lanes, and pedestrian space be assessed and weighed? Those are two things potentially. I'm not sure, Stuart, if that's something you can comment on, either of those two.
Yeah, that's a great comment. The way the study is that we're doing, it's set up to focus on the parking system. So we're looking at all of those sort of costs within that system. I do hear that comment about things that are outside of that system and how they might be considered and evaluated. I guess where that comes in is, you know, we are keeping an eye, like I mentioned, on the city's other strategies and goals that they have in place. One of which is that race to zero on carbon emission reductions. Other ones again is the transportation master plan that I keep mentioning. So there's city council approved strategies and goals that are working to consider and address those things. So we need to consider them as we do our study. The question of how they're kind of valued and brought into an analysis is one that it's a bit sort of beyond the parking budgets that we're looking at as far as any types of external costs and in terms of carbon emissions or anything else.
Thank you. There's a question that came up earlier in our discussion here tonight. It said, where did the projection of 1,000 new employees come from? Is it mainly Conestoga? I think that was on your long-term slide. So they're wondering where those projections of 1,000 new employees would be coming from. Is it mainly Conestoga?
I can jump in maybe there.
Okay.
No, it's separate from Conestoga College. It's an estimate that the city planners have provided of other employment growth in the downtown. It could be more people working in commercial businesses like stores or institutions or, you know, courthouses and things like that. And then in addition to that, there'll be the Conestoga College demand that's generated. And that 1,000 employees is like over 20 years. So it's not tomorrow. It's a gradual increase over a 20-year period.
Ralph, there's another comment on the same theme. The estimates of new demand for the changes coming in the midterm seem low. How were those numbers determined? I think you started to answer there with respect to the planning numbers. They wanted to know how those numbers were determined.
Yeah, we've assumed that growth for in the short term, medium term, we're talking about 5 to 10 years. So, you know, on average, it won't be as steady as the average number. We're assuming there'll be about 50 new employees in the downtown every year. And so it's a gradual growth plus Conestoga College arriving. If, you know, the college is taking over the space, as Stuart mentioned, that Cooperators, who was a big office employer, previously occupied, but they're moving to the south end of downtown. So in the short term, and given how long construction takes to occur and all of those factors, it's not likely, other than the college, that anything significant is going to happen for at least 5 years. You know, if somebody wanted to build a new office building or even a new apartment building tomorrow, it takes at least 3 years to build those things in most cases, plus they've got to get the approvals. So, you know, if we say we're looking at a 10-year time frame, really nothing much of any significance other than what's already been approved by the city and could be under construction, it isn't going to happen. So that's why maybe the short term seems a little low at first. There's sort of this 5-year slow period, and then it starts to ramp up.
Thank you. I'm watching our time, and I've got a number of comments I want to read out. So thank you, Ralph. Although it is commendable to cycle, very difficult for most people, and yet so much talk about bikes. Women make up 70% of our clientele and probably still do the lion's share of families driving around, although I know things are changing. Also, many people who come downtown are elderly, and so I find the whole push to biking really discriminates against women and the elderly. So I guess we'd want to thank you for your comment and recognize that there are many needs of many people, and the parking system has to balance out and provide services to those different needs. Don't know if Stuart, Ralph, you wanted to make any comments before I go on to the other piece we've got here. Another person writes, with respect to incentivizing parking in the parkades, which you've got here as potentially something to do, would there be consideration of a golf cart type shuttle from the parkades for those that object to walking too far to destinations downtown? That's at 7:47.
Yeah, that's something we've heard a few times, and again, I sort of mentioned one of the drawbacks of a shuttle can be a travel time aspect. It's not to dismiss it out of hand, but the current parkade locations are well, the 5 or 10 minute walking radius around those existing parkades covers most of downtown. So I acknowledge there's some areas that are further north up there. When you get up to the top end of Woolwich, etc., there's some longer distances up there. But I think for the most part, the majority of those uses within the downtown are kind of close-ish. So again, if you're faced with not wanting to or having mobility challenges, yes, that's a consideration that a little shuttle might be helpful in that regard. But I think for most trips, it's probably going to be a lot longer to wait for a shuttle than it would be to walk 5 or 10 minutes.
Another number of comments I want to read out. So charge to park in the parking garages, but use as a business receipt with a barcode to validate the parking for free. That was one suggestion. Another writes, it seems like a major impediment which has allowed people to overuse free parking is the fact that it's never been monitored properly. So therefore people park longer than they should. So thank you, we've heard that comment before. Another one writes as a comment, the current number of vehicles downtown already diminishes the enjoyment of visiting downtown. Free on-street parking might be a positive for people who drive. It's a significant drawback for people who want to visit through transit, walking, or bike. Another one writes, as you've noted, Guelph is a magnet for jobs with commuters driving from outlying areas, including KW. If the province follows through with their ill-conceived new Highway 7, which will induce even more travel, has the parking consulting team considered the impact of thousands of additional cars on city parking spaces, assuming fees continue to be low? That's at 8:18.
Yeah, just to comment on that quickly, not specifically, but again, we're looking at a range of scenarios, and those scenarios include sort of different proportions of people who would drive. So to some degree, yes, we're covering what might happen in that context of that comment. So if there's more downtown employment, as per the projections we've talked about, what are the impacts if different percentages of those people decide to drive versus take other options? So I think the short answer is yes, we're considering it, but not specific to that particular highway improvement.
And I've got one other one here, which is, does the city know how much it costs in a subsidy to subsidize a parking space in a parkade? And will the parkades break even over their lifetime? That's at 8:04.
I think that sort of relates to what I tried to describe earlier. I mean, it's going to cost at least 55 or 60,000 a space to build parking. If we wanted to charge people monthly parkers, like employees, enough to recover the cost, they would have to pay something close to $250 or $300 a month. So the city already doesn't cover the cost of parking in new garages. The old ones have been paid for a long time ago. And if it has to build more new garages, that gap will only get bigger. A lot of downtowns that charge for on-street parking use the money they make from on-street parking, because it doesn't cost that much to operate on-street parking. It's just the extra pavement. They use that money to fill the gap to fund the cost of parking garages. When you have a situation like you do in Guelph and some other downtowns where you don't get that revenue from the on-street, then the difference simply has to be picked up by the general taxpayers in the city. So it's it's not likely that we'll ever get to the point, because the prices for parking, even though, people have, valid concerns here about the cost that it already is, aren't nearly enough to cover the cost of providing it. So, compared to downtown, if you look at downtown Toronto or any of those other locations, the price of parking is well above, right in the core, well above $300 a month. Sometimes it's $500 a month, and then you can pay for the cost of providing parking. But in most medium-sized and smaller cities, that isn't the case.
Thank you, Rob. One of the things, we've got another question here, the pace of change and how change occurs. I think you addressed in an earlier slide, and maybe you can come back to that in sort of final remark. The question here is, what do you think would happen to the Stone Road Mall if there was little or no parking there?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I was going to say, yeah, well, to be simplistic, and businesses that need customers have to get them from somewhere. So, I can't really imagine a Stone Road Mall with no parking scenario, unless that Stone Road Mall was surrounded by high density residential and office, which it isn't. So it's kind of the people have to come from somewhere. If they none of them can drive there, then you've all got to come from transit or walking or cycling. And I think in the current state of affairs anyway, that's not realistic for Stone Road Mall.
Yeah, the same person writes in, how is the downtown any different? So when you're making comparisons, that's their follow-up question.
Yeah, the interesting thing about downtowns is it probably isn't much different in terms of attracting customers. The difference in a traditional downtown like Guelph, and it's typical in most downtowns, is the Stone Road Mall pays for the parking, and the cost of it comes from the rent that the people in the stores pay. In downtown Guelph, roughly half the parking is provided by the city instead of by the businesses. And so, the difference would be if the businesses in downtown Guelph paid for the city's parking, then you would have sort of the equivalent situation. But that's not likely to happen because of the history of traditional downtowns, because they were built a long time ago. They don't have any room to build their own parking. They've been built up over many decades, 50 or 60 years. And so traditionally cities have ended up providing the parking spaces. But it's back to, people have this conception that somehow parking is free. It isn't at the Stone Road Mall. As I described it goes, the rents in the stores are higher there because the store owners are paying for the cost of the parking indirectly in their rent, and that's how come there's free parking at the Stone Road Mall. But if it doesn't happen in that way, then you either have to collect money by charging for it, or it gets absorbed some other way. So that's sort of the me trying to explain the parallel between the two. Thanks.
So, but there's I think there's an argument brewing here, which is the contrast of apples versus oranges. So I've got two more comments, and I am watching our time. So another writes, but they believe the density of taxes that are generated in downtown is high. So I guess that's counter to your argument. So there's obviously a lot at play here. It's very complicated, and we really appreciate the people being very candid and very direct with your comments. It's very important. I think someone else just wanted to question that you'd referenced that it was on-street parking is cheap to maintain as it's just extra pavement. This doesn't consider the income foregone by taxable uses of very valuable real estate. And is your team making these considerations? That's at 827. I don't know if that's something you just made a comment to take back in terms of how when the references. And I've got one final comment here is that downtown generates 4 times the tax revenue of the Stone Road commercial area, despite our downtown being half the size and having half the parking spaces. We already have too much land for cars allocated in our downtown. The more space allocated for cars, the less space we have for people and businesses. So we really appreciate, these are very passionate discussions, and the importance of being a vibrant downtown and successful is foremost in the study as well. So that certainly, we appreciate that information. Someone writes, Ralph, thank you for those stats. And that may be the stats for someone else has provided, not you, Pratt, per se. So in terms of the stats, but I want to appreciate, we are at 8:29, so about 1 more minute. It says, in case you didn't know, reverse angle parking is when you back into a space. I believe they knew that, but I think just that's a good clarification. So reverse angle parking is when you back into the space as opposed to go in frontwards to the angle space.
Yeah, I think somebody asked if we were considering that. We haven't been specifically there. As you know, there's angle parking there today where you drive in. The idea is reverse angle parking is a little safer. The problem with that is you end up with the tailpipes of all the cars right where you want to put patios, which doesn't work very well from that point of view. Yeah, we're aware of the idea of reverse angle parking.
Stuart, could you put the next slide up, please? So I want to thank everyone for the discussion, the questions and comments this evening, and these will be noted in the feedback report and considered by the team as they finalize their recommendations. We want to make sure that you have the contact information for Jamie at jamie.zettel@guelph.ca, and for Stuart, if there's some follow-up questions or comments or things that you think, gee, we want to articulate that further, please do so. And then there is the survey, and here it is at http://www.haveyoursayguelph.ca. So there will be some questions there specific to the cost of parking. There are some questions there about other ideas about how to make transit work. There's also questions there about the 4 scenarios, asking if they align with your vision, and there's a general comment box. So you may be able to put additional feedback in there as well. As noted, the team, BA Group, is looking to put recommendations together and to take a report to Committee of the Whole in September. And certainly you'd be able to make a delegation should you wish to do so at that meeting in September. So Ralph and Stuart and Jamie, if you have maybe a 30-second comment before we wrap up for this evening.
Just quickly from me, thank you everybody for coming tonight, and thank you for the comments and questions. Those some really great and thoughtful questions. We did our best to answer them. I hope we got to them all. That was my question, Sue. I don't know if you were.
I read them all out.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Just thank you to everybody. It's very useful to hear all of these comments and the thought that's gone into them. Appreciate it.
And the slides will be up on the website, and the video of the presentation will be up on the website, and a transcript of the questions will be also up on the website. It may be a couple of days before we do that. Jamie, I saw your camera go on. I saw your camera go off. So at this point, maybe just if you want to say thank you to everybody, and we will conclude our meeting.
Well, I was going to jump in, and Stuart beat me to it, but thank you all for attending. It's greatly appreciated. We are in the heat of the discussion, and this is where we need to be right now before we start to develop our recommendations. So thank you for your feedback.
Thank you, everyone. At this point, being a virtual meeting, you can hang up on us. So push the end button, and we do hope to have further feedback from you again with the survey. So thank you, everyone. Be safe. Have a good evening.
Thanks.